So today, as I said, we're going to be talking about typography. It's really the element as we start working with it that a lot of times tends to be one of the last things we put on it. Yet is the one thing that is going to communicate a lot based upon what it is that we choose for that typography. So it's not really, don't want to be that afterthought. Really think about how you can work it in, and then we'll even talk a little bit in typography what else we can do to typography to enhance it. So we're not dealing with just this is the typeface we have, this is the typeface we have to use, we can't make it look any different. I'll talk about the fact that we can actually add to what is there. So we're going to look at the anatomy of type. So what is the type? What is type? What is the type anatomy? And we start talking about the different parts of it. How did it get what it is to what it is? Where does it come from? We start looking at some of the things that we've been using, that you've been using for years, that you will get a better understanding as to where exactly it comes from and how do we get to what's there. We're going to get into some general type classifications. We'll talk about basic designing with types, so the design principles as we go in and begin to use type, starting to think about what's happening with where is it that we're going to be using that type at. And we'll start looking at typeface pairings. So what we're going to put together, we start talking about our display type, our heading type, body copy, and how do those actually enhance one another. We start looking a little bit at weights. We'll look at spacing. So we start getting into spacing. What happens with that? So we start talking about turning, space between two characters, tracking, space amongst a line of characters. We start getting into leading, or line spacing as you're used to hearing it called. How do we go through and use that as well? We'll get into a little bit about web type. We start dealing with screen. What's the difference between a screen versus a print? Dealing, of course, with the nice little square pixels that you have on the screen, as opposed to the dots we go through and we start running into print. And then we'll start talking about ways that we can go through and begin to be a little bit more expressive with typography. Choosing how we write something out. What can we do with it? How do we control it? What is the atmosphere of it? We start thinking about type. Type has a lot of relations back to when we start thinking about auditory stuff. Start thinking about sound. What is it that you choose? As we start talking about spacing, you get a rhythm going. So it's like playing music. So we're going to go through and start to look at how we can be expressive with type. So we go and we start thinking about type. The typeface, though, we start looking at that's an overall design of a single set of characters. So when we start talking about typeface, what is the typeface? Well, the typeface is Times New Roman 12 point. Because we're dealing not only with the characters themselves and the characteristics of those characters, we're actually talking about then the size of them in there. So as we start getting into those properties, what are those consistent visual properties? We could go all the way to talk about going in and designing a typeface if we wanted to. Now, as we go in and start to design it, what characters do we start with? You know, if we start going in there and we have a D. If we have a D, we have a B. If we have a B, we have a P. We most likely probably have a Q. So as we start to think about those characters, how are we designing? What are the characteristics we're going to have of them? The other thing to do as a designer as well is you're going to start to put that information inside of your head. If I go through and I choose this typeface and I already know that I like the way this B looks, we know what other characters we have and the characteristics that are going to follow with it. The key on that is as we go through to work with those properties. So how we go and we design a serif. If you have a serif typeface, we know that serif has to be consistent as it moves through the other characters. So if we have a real nice geometric serif going onto there, we need to keep that consistent as we move through ultimately the entire set that we are building. When we start talking about the font, what is the font? Now, we already use typeface and font interchangeable. Everyone does it, so it's not to the point where someone's going to be like smacking you over the hand with a ruler if you interchange. When we go and we start looking at the font is actually that digital file. Now, with that digital file, it's going to have all of the sizes inside of there. When you think about that, so instead of just being Times New Roman 12 point, it's Times New Roman. Whether it's 12, 14, 16, 18, 24, 36, 48, 72, it doesn't really matter. That's going to be the font. So when we start talking about the font is Times New Roman. The typeface is Times New Roman 12. As you start to think about how those go in there. Most people, when they talk about, oh, I'm using times, my font's Times New Roman 12. Well, it's going all the way down. It's actually kicking it all the way down to the typeface. If you get really interested in typography, you can go through, completely design the characters. You can design them inside of Illustrator. There's a few font programs out there that you can go ahead and you can just drop them in there, and then you can export out a type file. It's going to go in there and have everything you need. So when you look at it, either a open type or a true type, you can create those, and then you can actually upload it into the system and actually type with a typeface that you've gone in and designed. So my awesome font 12.S. Now we get into starting to look at the overall elements of type. Don't go back, instead go to this one. So we go through and start looking at it. Inside of your book, you're going to see this full breakdown. This is what we have as type if we start looking at it from a standpoint of historical type, and we're dealing with foundries. So these are all typefaces that are, or type elements that are created and utilized inside of putting together type. So if you ever go anywhere when you start talking about old printing presses, this is how they're going to build it. You go to Boston and you start looking at, they got one of the old presses there. When they're going through and they crank it down, that print is coming from this type of type. So we go through and start looking at metal type. We start getting into these blocks here. You see these blocks. Those blocks on there is lead. They are strips of lead. That's why we talk about line spacing, we talk about it as leading. If you get into the Adobe applications, they're all going to refer to leading. It's because we run strips like that to create the space between our rows of type. And we start looking at the overall height. So what is the height of our copy? Well, that's going to go from the bottom of the block to the top of the block. So when we look at this, we have our body over here. That's the point size. So when you go through and you choose point size, in whatever application you're using, that's that whole length of that block that's been created based on the foundry. Now again, these are all made out of, or made through a process of pouring in this case, steel to create the type. We start getting into looking at the X height. How does that vary? We look at the set width. How wide are the characters? We start looking at the different strokes. What's happening with that? We start getting into the spacing. You'll see in between the D's, and then also in between the D to the next character over to the right. What's happening with that is we have different blocks. So we start looking at the spacing between characters, which is our kerning. We have those individual blocks then that go into there. So how are we using those spacing quads? Now we don't have any actual blocks like this. Still kick myself a few years ago for not buying. There were some at a garage sale, and I should have just bought them to have them in here to work with, but I didn't buy them. But it's kind of neat to look at those, and we start talking about uppercase versus lowercase. Where does that come from? This comes from these blocks themselves. So what used to happen was all of what we know as lowercase characters were on the lower case. All of the uppercase were on the upper shelf area. Hence where they came from on uppercase and lowercase. So become familiar where this is. Are you going to be going in and setting type? Most likely not. But as we go through to work with these, just depending on where you're at, I've seen some places that have old type, they work with it, and they'll simply go in. I've seen them put rubber bands around them to hold them into place. A lot of times they'll use twine. They'll just wrap the twine around there, tie it off, and then you'll set it up on the ink across it, sometimes with a roller, and then simply put the paper on there, press it down, peel the paper back off. At the bottom part down here, we're going to see measurements. So if we go and we start to look at measurements, these are measurements just to get used to, because depending on what application you're in and working with, you're going to see these. The one that most of you are familiar with is dealing with or working with are points. If you're looking at point size for type. But when we get down and really start working onto it, when you get into things like page layout, InDesign, desktop publishing, you're going to see picas used a lot more. So we get into and start thinking about what's happening with this. What we have is we have 6 picas are going to equal 1 inch. We see that we have 72 points equal 1 inch. Therefore, quick math, 1 point is equal to a 72nd of an inch. And then if we start looking at our 6 picas being an inch, we know it's 72 points, we then have that our 12 points equal 1 pica. He said, if you're doing desktop publishing, get used to the fact that everything inside of InDesign, we work in picas. So when we get in there working with that, know that we're dealing with picas and points. So everybody have that down? You gonna start measuring things now in picas just for fun? No? I'm 442 picas tall. Nobody's gonna do that? All right. Now we start looking at the additional types. So we talked a little bit about X height and set width. This will indicate to us that as we start thinking about how much space are things taking up. So our X height, think about our lowercase x would fit in here, gives us our X height. Our set width is how wide our individual characters are. Our ascenders go above the line indicating our X height, and then we go down here and we start looking at our descenders. They actually go then below that baseline. We look at the terminal. How does the characters ultimately go through and terminate? What's the end look like? So we start to go in and begin to use these. There are a lot of different terms that you're going to see as we go and we start talking about type. So we have that horizontal or diagonal stroke that comes off of a stem. So we start thinking like K. So we start dealing with arms and legs. As I said, we've got the A center that goes above, D center goes down, baseline's where all our characters sit. When we start talking about axis or axis of stress, we're going to start dealing with, if we draw a line through our characters, where is that at? This really comes into play more so when we start having variable width characters. So if you start thinking about calligraphy, as you move those through, how are you drawing it? Where is that line you go through to split it, to divide it up in equal parts? Get used to what the terminology is inside of here. So we start looking at our lowercase g. We start dealing with our loops. We start dealing with our e's. We start dealing with the i's. So when we go in and deal with an arm, arms, you typically want to refer to an arm if you talk about a lowercase k, arms going up, leg comes down. So get used to those terms, start to understand those terms, start to utilize those terms a bit more. Are you going to have them completely down? No. There's even still some of them that may be mentioned. You're like, wait, what is that? I mean, even to the point that you're not really pushing through and thinking about what's there. We start talking about counters. So you start looking at the inside of our O's. That's really any space that's enclosed with it. The E, technically, when we look at talk about the I and the E, that's still a counter. It's enclosed by the stroke. So in some of these things, we still go through and start to use them. It's really a choice as to what it is that you want to talk about or what you want to work with. So we get into classifications. So we start talking about classifications of type. You're going to see that we can expand off of what is here. Are there more that are out there? If we really want to get into semantics, yes, we can really push this far beyond the ones that we're actually going to talk about, mainly because people are creating typefaces that are going to fall into serif or sans serif guaranteed. But outside of that, then we're going to start looking at, well, what are the characteristics of what is there? So we get into our old style or humanist. These are our Roman typefaces. We start talking about 15th century. Most of these are designed, of course, from a actual pen, so a broad edged pen that you would have used back in that time. So in this case, we're going to have angled or bracketed serifs. We're going to go in and we're going to have a bias of stress, because it's talking about, when we talk about that normal stroke, as you're pressing down, especially with that broad edge, you're going to get variances in line thickness or stroke weights as we go through and move them. So Caslon, Garamond, Heffler text, and then Times New Roman, which I'm pretty sure everybody in here has used at least once, safe to say, maybe twice.
You see it a lot if you take an English composition class.
Then you're going to be forced to use it. I force in a lot of my classes, if there's a set length for writing, because we can talk a little bit about how you can make a paper a little bit longer, by what you choose to use for a typeface. So I specifically will say you have to use Times New Roman, regular, 12-point width, 1.5 spacing. So I'll do that so it's there. Because there are secrets, and let me tell you, when you go to an art school and you have to write an English comp paper, and you've already had all of this stuff, you know all kinds of secrets to make it just add just the slightest bit to it to make the paper long enough that when you print it out and you hand it in, it still looks good, but you gained yourself about another paragraph just by dealing with the typography. As we talk about that set width, you choose something that's a little wider character because they don't specify what you have to use. Now we all of a sudden, our 8 characters take up the amount of space of 9. So every 8th character, you get that 9th one free. It's kind of like when you go to the store and you buy 10, you get the 11th free. It's kind of how it works as you start to play a little bit with the typography. As you get those 10 characters, the 11th characters free. So when we start to work with it, you'll understand kind of what's going to happen with that. I don't remember if there's the slide in here that compares all of them. Inside of your book, though, diagram 3.3, it does have a breakdown. You start to look at what's happening with old style versus traditional versus modern. So it really starts to get into see characters, how they work, overlapping of individual characters as well. If we go into, it skipped one. If we go into transitional, so these are serif typefaces. We're getting about 18th century. In this case, we're looking at transitioning from that old style up to the modern style of type. So in this case, we're going to go in and start to look at what are the characteristics. Well, we're going to see some of those old style humanist things, and we're also going to see some things that are going to show up in our modern type as well. We go through, we start looking at what happens inside of art history just in general. Is that we always have one movement moving into another movement. That next movement usually has to do with resistance to the movement prior to it, trying to fight what's there and push into something new. That's where we get into this transitional. It's called transitional because we are doing that. We're transitioning from that old style into then eventually what's going to become our modern style of typography. So as you go through and you start to look at what's happening with it, you're going to see that axis still on there. You're going to see some varying line thicknesses. But we're going to start moving into what becomes a little bit more of a geometrical shape as we get into the modern typefaces. That's where we start getting away from where we might have characters that the stress comes right down the middle, but they're very vertical type elements. Into that and going into geometric. So we're going to start to see those circles really coming in to the shapes. You may even start to see then when we start dealing with our stems that start to get more in that rectangular feel to them. So Baskerville Century and ITC Zap International are ones that are inside of there. That Zap name you may have seen from Dingbats and that Herman Zap. So designed a lot of typefaces. We jump into our modern. So now we get into our modern. These are serif typefaces. These are late 18th, early 19th. So we start talking about the transitionals. We're moving through the 18th. Once we get to the end of the 18th, into the 19th century, that's when we start getting into our modern typefaces. Like I said, they are geometric in construction. So as opposed to what we have on those old style typefaces, in this case what we're going to look at is we're getting away from just what is that real nature of that pen use. So at this point in time, when we get into there, we're going to start to see that we're going to see a heavy contrast, the thick, thin. So instead of trying to really focus in on what would that pen look like as we go through and begin to write with it, we're now accentuating that. Kind of think about how calligraphy goes, and as we bring around that stroke, if you hold that right, you get that nice thin line. Well, that's what we get when we start looking at our modern typefaces. So we see we still have our axis of stress. Typically it's going to be straight up and down. But if you go in and you start to look at it, circles, your E, and we start getting into our D's and our B's and our P's and our Q's. Those all have that very geometric design to them. But the biggest thing that we go and we start to look at is that thick-thin contrast. So as soon as you see that go through and you get that real thin area of the stroke, but then it widens up on those verticals, you're most likely sitting in something that's modern. Yes, they exist inside of our transitional because they're moving between there. When we start looking at it from the standpoint of our typeface, in this case, these are going to be the most symmetrical typefaces you're going to have in there based on the Roman characters. So we start to look at that. You draw a line right through the middle of it. On any of those strokes, you're going to find that they are consistent on either side. So Didot, Bodoni, and Walbum are all ones that are listed inside of here. The next one that we're going to go to then is our slab serif. So when we start looking at these are serif typefaces. So now we're going to start to see those serifs coming into play. As we're using those, these are going to be heavy slabs. I mean, when we start looking at how our strokes end up working from one to another, they're going to be typically consistent in stroke width. So as it goes up and reaches the top, we're going to get this nice solid slab coming off of them. If you look inside the book, figure 3.5 has them listed over there, and you can see the slab serif that's there. Notice that when we talk about the vertical strokes, horizontal strokes, then we have the serifs in. Unlike other typefaces where we're going to go in and start dealing with a fillet and that, these are solid slabs, blocks. If I gave you Lego blocks, the easiest way to explain it, you can build this with no problem because they're nice solid shapes to them. With these, we start looking at subcategories. So as I talked about, as we begin working with type, you're going to see that we have main categories, there's subs, and then when we get into other ones, we could run off on an entire rabbit hole and continue down it as we go looking at all of them that fit inside of there. But Egyptian and Clarendon are two subcategories that go into here. So American typewriter. If you go back and you start looking at the old typewriters, that's exactly what was on there. The typewriter font was designed as slab serifs inside of there. Memphis, ITC, Lubal, and Graph, Bookman, and Clarendon, as I said, are all ones that are inside of here. So we get into sans serif typefaces. Now in this case, we don't have any serifs. So as we go through and we start looking at the strokes, when we think about the serifs began, of course, by handwriting. When you go to set that pen down to move it for the stroke, typically you tended to get a little bit of a stroke from that. So when we go through and start looking at this, now there are no serifs. So this is early 19th century. We're going to go in and begin to use these characters away from those serifs. So with that, we get into our Futuras, Helvetica, and Universe. So when we go through and start to also see these, you're going to see on here it talks about sans serif typefaces, and in there we see subcategories that list grotesque, humanist, geometric, and others. And that's because when we get into talking about them, a lot of times you will hear them use grotesque in the sense that there isn't anything there for serifs. So like Helvetica's Die Neuhaus grotesque is actually, was an official name as that typeface was being developed. We get into there are some thick and thin strokes. So again, depending on how the typeface was assembled, and that's you will find that sometimes your verticals strokes are larger than your horizontal strokes. So they will move through. It's not necessarily going to be consistent. Slab serif, most of those have the same strokes all the way through. Black letter. So these are 13th to 15th century. So we're going to jump back a little bit to go start to look at what's happening with these. So start thinking all your medieval manuscripts. As you've gone through and looked at, or if you're done any research dealing with medieval times, then you have reviewed a ton of black letter. You may also see the typefaces listed as Gothic. So we start looking at these are really heavy stroke weights, usually have condensed letters with few curves. The other thing you're going to see inside of here then is sometimes there are additional flourishes and embellishments to the text that's in there. We go back to Gutenberg's Bible. So we talk about Gutenberg's Bible, 42-line Bible. With that, what we have on there is black letter. That's what was used to go through and use that. It used the textura typeface, which is of course a black letter style. There are other ones inside of here. Rotunda, Schwabacher, and Frankter are three that they list on here as well. You get into your Old English characters, same type of thing with them. Script. So in here, these are the ones that mostly resemble handwriting. So we typically then have an angled axis of stress. So when we start looking at that, if we're going to draw a line through our strokes, it's most likely going to have a slant to that. Most of our characters then in this case are designed to be joined. If you're using a script typeface, make sure that as you use that, you're aware of how far the strokes end up coming off before they're actually going to link to one another. If you take anything that's a script typeface and you extend the kerning or tracking out too far, you get gaps. You get them too close, they start to overlap one another. So as you go through and begin to use them, know that they're working off of that pen. So the pen idea with it is what we're going to use. Brush script, Allegro script, roundhand script are ones they list on here. As you go through and we start working with type, the one thing that I'll talk about is beginning to choose typefaces and start to learn what each one of them can do for you. The last one inside of here that we're going to look at then is display type. So these are ones that are designed for larger sizes. So headlines, titles, possibly down into some subtitles. That's what display text is designed for. If you go through and start to use that as the body copy text, you're going to find that it's probably pretty difficult to read. That's typically why we have these that fall into really just display. Now we get into display. They're often elaborated, decorated, handmade, which is a key thing inside of here, and fall into any of the other classifications. So they can go anywhere inside of there. The big thing though, we start talking about handmade, or even if we want to take it and just say elaborate on the text, or decorate the text, is don't think when we start dealing with type that you are left with only what you see as the type. All the applications allow us to take type, turn it into a vector, and then we can continue to draw off of those. Another way that we also work with it is as you start to lay out the text you want to add to it. You go ahead and you create that print, you put it on a light table, put a nice piece of tracing paper over top of it, trace to it, and then draw off and add those embellishments. You can fill them in with a marker. Then we can scan that back in or take an image of it and then bring it in and turn it back into another vector artwork. So don't think that you're stuck only using what you see on there. There's all kinds of things we can do with type to embellish it and elaborate on it so that it actually does a lot more for us. Questions on classifications? No? Now as you go into these, what's going to happen when we start dealing with type is that they're a family. So what do we mean when we're talking about type family? Well, what we have is we have a lot of variations that exist inside of a single typeface. So maybe you have a light, you have a medium, and you have a bold, for example, could all be in there. And each of those could have its own italicized typeface as well. As you begin to work with these, you're going to find that inside of applications, many years ago, you didn't have the ability to go in and create something as italicized if it didn't exist inside of the family. Applications now are allowing us to go in and inside of the character panel, we're able to go ahead and select faux bold. So if you choose a typeface that doesn't have a bold and you choose faux bold, it gives you that, call it bold appearance. Really what it does is it adds a stroke essentially to the text. We go through and we start dealing with the fact that you can do faux italic. All faux italic does is essentially skew your text a little bit. But those options are available in there. Many years ago, you had heard a lot of people talking about if it doesn't have a bold, it's not supposed to have a bold. And to the point that typographers would be rolling over in their grave knowing probably that you can go and click on a button and all of a sudden there's ends up with a faux bold or a faux italics, because it wasn't designed that way. It's an art form when we go and we start to work with typography, and that's the way it continues. But you can still do that stuff that's inside of there. So like I said, you might have light, mediums, bolds. If they don't exist in there, there's other things we can also do with them. Along with it too, we also have our extended family and our super family that we can work with. So when we start looking at the extended family, that gets us into things like maybe a hairline or extended or condensed. So we start talking about a condensed style. Condensed styles typically are going to go in there and they're going to smash that set width. So we're reducing down what exactly the set width is for that. Now as we go and we start to design with type, you need to really think about what is the typeface that you're using. What is it based on? What is it going into? So we start looking at its shape. We want something geometrical. We want something tall. We want something wide. We want something heavy. Like, what is it you're trying to say with it? And imagine if you're going in and talking about something heavy and you choose this really light, dainty font. You know, what do you want it to show? What do you want it to control? When we go through and start to look at it, we start looking at balance. What's going to be happening between our display type for our headings and our body copy? As you go through and choose them, you're going to start to see that we start to have then this color to them. And by color, I'm talking about when we go and we deal with body copy. Does it get really heavy, really black? Does it overpower what we have as our headline? What are the relationships between those? Where are we using this at? Are we printing it, or is it going on a screen? If you start to work for, major corporations or new companies that are going to brand themselves, understanding what is the primary place in which they're going to be using this content. If it's all digital, we need to make sure that whatever typeface we're choosing works inside of the digital world. Put it on a screen, what's it going on to? We start talking about everything from giant billboards down to your cell phone, or maybe even as small as a smartphone, smartwatch. What's going to happen with that? Where does it have to go to? How is the stuff going to look? So as we start to work with it, we start to design with type. Make sure you do some type studies. Okay, I'm working with this, it's going on a billboard. Yeah, it's great on a billboard. Oh, I put it on this little tiny screen, it looks horrible. As we start losing it because of based on the pixels. Now, it's crazy to think that what you wear on your wrist actually has a higher pixel density than most of the first color monitors that existed. So with that, this is starting to kind of move itself away a little bit more because, again, we have the ability to show more pixels on our displays. As you go through and choose the type, make sure that it is actually readable. Now, when we talk about that, sometimes it's legible. Well, yeah, you want to be able to recognize some characters, but you want to make sure that it's readable. As you go through and start to look at it, what's happening with this? How are we reading it? How does it work through there? We talk about margins. What's happening with your margins? Large margins, small margins. Are we going through and having a larger right side margin than our left side? So as you start to think about what's happening with them, what's happening with those margins? When we talk about design, it's all in reference to the margins. How are we actually working with those? Left aligned, right aligned, we start dealing with copy. Deals with, are we aligned to the left margin or the right margin? We go through and deal with justified text. It's going to go across and hit each of the margins. As we drive that text across and it hits each of those margins, what ends up happening with it is that provides then what we're seeing as that image that's created by text. Because as you go through and you build your text, the weight of your text is going to also function just like as we're working in with images. The other thing with our text is it has to be integrated with the images. So we start thinking about the hierarchy. How do we see things on the page? If you go through and you put body copy in there and it becomes really heavy and you have this really light, airy image on there, we're going to see the text first. Okay, not saying that that's bad, but It's just be aware that as you're working with those two things, how are you integrating the text along with those images? And then we go through, start looking at transitions between the actual letters, the words, and the paragraphs. So how are we moving from word to word, letter to letter? The spacing is going to come into play. If you use justified text, what is the spacing between those words? If you have too much spacing between the words, what ends up happening is we create what we call rivers. So you get a river in there, and what do rivers do? If you're in the middle of a city and you jump in the river, where are you going to end up? You're not going to drown. I'm saying, okay, you got on a life jacket. Where are you going to end up when it's all said and done? At the bottom, exactly, or outside of the city. So what's going to happen with there, if you go through and you develop and you put in something that's justified text, and you have this giant gap in it, and we call a river going through it. The reader goes over, they hit that, and it's just like a margin, you just flow right down. Next thing you know, you're at the bottom of the page, you're like, wait a minute, I was supposed to be reading the rest of that stuff. So you want to watch that gets there, especially for people like me. I'll get distracted really, really easy by it, and I'll go, oh wow, look at this. There's a big gap in the text. So make sure you're looking at that. So your spacing is going to make or break it. We also start talking about that rhythm. There's music in the text. You go through and you start to read the stuff. How does it flow? What is the beat that you have as you begin to work through it? Now I talked a little bit about the whole thing that we're dealing with text, and then text leads over into images because we see it together. Type also then has shapes, and they are shapes. So when we start to look at what's happening with our text, we have positive and negative shapes that we're able to work with. So as we go through and start to build them, what's going to happen with them? So we typically will look at it from the standpoint of whatever we have as our stroke. So if you take your pen or pencil and put on the page and write your name, what you actually wrote out, those strokes themselves are actually going to be our positive shapes. Everything else behind it, the background type area, we're going to look at then as the negative shapes that are created because of what you've gone through and drawn. How can we use those? Both in a design element like you see here with the 3 and the 9, or even inside the book it also shows then a logo for CE software. So how can we use those? How can we use these shapes? Really going in and thinking about the positive and negative space. So we go into types of shapes even more. So what we have over here on the right hand side, these are all different letter forms, different typefaces, and we can start to see what is the appearance of them. So these are all in the same size, but you start to look at what amount of space does each one of them take up. So you start to see, if we look at it from a height standpoint, we look at it from a weight standpoint, what ones have the most punch to them. I mean, as you look at this, where were you drawn to?
Sorry, the corundum. That's a very bold looking one.
On this one? What, down here?
That one.
This one?
The entire line has
The entire line. Okay. I was kind of looking at it even from a character standpoint. Which character grabbed you right away? So Clarendon grabbed a hold of her eye just as an overall line. Why do you think that she saw that? This is a choice. There's no right or wrong answers.
It's the boldest line.
Boldest. So if we go back and we talk about what's the easiest way to make us focus on an individual object? Make it the biggest and the boldest. If you do that, guaranteed it's going to draw your focus. So we start talking about that, scale and density. So in this case, the focus there on that is because of the fact that, again, we're looking at it from a standpoint of being bold. So is that a serif or a sans serif? It's a serif. It tells you right here too, a couple times. See, slab serif, so Egyptian. See that bold thing? Like I said, if you think about it kind of like a slab of concrete, that's what it is. If you talk about it on the top of the T, you know, they kind of just set it on there. You'll see down here, thick serifs. They do go through and explain what you have on here. So we go through and look at these. How many sans serif are up there? One. So the last one down there, Helvetica. Helvetia. That's the one that's up there. That's the most common one. Every single one of you have seen that typeface used in designs and logos and that probably over 1 million times in your life. It's the most commonly used one. It's everywhere. So if you start to look at, you know, the creation of that, the use of that, Vignelli, he actually used that pretty much exclusively throughout his whole career. Nothing but Helvetica, Helvetica, Helvetica. And it's even a running joke because the mausoleum in which he, I believe, is now buried in, they use Optima as their typeface for all of the names. And there was a big thing. There's a movie out there called Helvetica. It's all about that typeface. At some point, we'll probably watch it in this class. It's great, absolutely great one. So when we start looking at things, we want to start comparing what happens. Get used to doing type studies like this. So as you go and you start to work with logos, have something like this, so you're trying to figure out the punch on it. The other thing too is to not be afraid to go in and use various typefaces and see how it looks and evaluate that out. So as we go through and we start to work to select a typeface, think about your audience. Who has to look at this? Who's going to use it? What's the overall demographics that you have for that? What's the design concept? What are you trying to say with it? As we start dealing with type, what you choose for a typeface also speaks to it. The message, the purpose, and the context. So start thinking about it. Where's this going to? Are we simply going in and taking this and going to place this in an online setting? Okay, well, we need to make sure it works there. Are we going to print it? Yes. So what's it going to be printed on? So then we start dealing with, what can we read? Business card versus something much larger. Are we going to use this display? So headings or text, we start talking about body. So when they refer to this as display or text or both, we're talking about display, headings, text, body copy. Where's it going to be seen at? Print versus screen. How much text are we using? Think about all caps. How many people in here love reading all caps if they get an email?
Well, this is great.
That would be fine. If that's all your email says, is that's right. But yes, everybody thinks that when you get it,
It's like in all caps, it's like someone's screaming.
yes, and that's what we get from it. So all caps, we see them screaming at us. And I always say, not only do we think they're screaming at us because of the size of it, we think they're screaming at us because it makes us aggravated at the standpoint that it's so hard to read. So what exactly are we doing with that? We start looking at types. What is it we're using for type? What are we selecting for type? What's going to happen with it? Get used to understanding what works and what doesn't work. You're going to find, what's that? Someone said so. All right. As we move into understanding type, choosing typefaces that you like, ones that you know how to work with. Use them over and over and over again. As you go through and start to work with it, you're going to begin to understand how things are functioning, where they're going to be seen at. We're going to go through and we're starting to look at typefaces that we don't want to use as display typefaces, or use display typefaces for body copy. Because if it's a display, it's designed to be larger. We make it smaller, it's probably going to get really hard for us to read. And how many people in here like reading something that's struggle to read? Nobody? No, I'm the same way. If I can't read it, it's too hard to follow, I stop. That's like even when we start talking about designing, we start designing things from a digital nature. You'll hear from me when you take 279. It's all about, when we're working on something digitally, I want to keep moving forward. It's even a Steve Jobs thing. He's all about move forward. Don't make someone go back. When you make someone go back, they feel like what they've just done kind of gets thrown out. You spent 5 minutes reading this, and you're telling me to go back to the previous page? No, we move forward. We go to the next step. Even if the next step somehow links us back through what that next thing is. There's a difference between going forward, between going back. And you hit a wall and you got to turn around and go back, you feel like you're regressing. If you go up there, it's like, okay, take a right. You take a right, you step back into that other room, and you get to choose another route. It still feels like you're moving forward. So think about that as we go through. We start to look at what it is that we are using. Then we start working with type. we're going to get stuff that goes in and starts to deal with our images. We start bringing images in. So with that, we have some decisions that we have to go through and make. So do you want your image and your type to actually share characteristics? Maybe. Do you want to go through and do you want there to be a heavy contrast between the text and the image? Maybe. Do we want to go through and have it to where the type kind of just floats over here and the image drives it? Maybe. So this is where we have to go and we have to start to think about what's happening with this. Do we actually want the type to drive the design? Do we want the image to drive the design? Do we want one to kind of disappear? How are we going to go through and start to work with those? Those are all things that we have to start to think about as we go through and choose them. Which element is the dominant element inside the design, and which one is carrying what it is that you want to do with it? So go back to when we start looking at association. If you're choosing to design a book cover for something, what's the focus? Is the focus the author? Or is the focus the image to draw people into that genre? Just depends on where we're at inside of the series. We've talked a little bit more about book jacket design later on. You'll start to see that there's a lot of ways that that can ultimately end up going. So we talk about spacing. The big thing as we get into spacing, what do we have for the spacing between our characters? What happens if we have a word and we allow too much spacing between two characters?
It looks like it's two separate words.
Right. It's going to look like two separate words. So then it's going to slow us down. It's going to make us look at this a little bit longer. Try to figure out what's being said. It's important as you go through and you start working in magazines, if you're going to have a design that's going to span across that center gutter. What's going to happen? How are the words going to show up on there? If we have a word that has to span that gutter, what's going to happen potentially with it? So as we talk about adjusting the spacing between individual letters, that's our kerning. If we get into word spacing, that's the spatial space between the two different words. As we go and we start dealing with justified, that's where we're going to get a variance inside of word spacing. We're going through left align. You're going to have a consistent setting for what's going to happen with the word spacing. We start getting into line spacing. We look at baseline to baseline. So we talk about line spacing. That's what it is. Where's the baseline distance down to the next baseline? If our height, our point size, and our line spacing are set to the same value, that's what we're going to call set solid. In that case, there is no lead between them. There would be one block copy sitting right on top of the other block. So when we start looking at that, that's the spacing there. We call it leading because as we talked about dealing with it, that we'd typically have little strips of lead that we would place inside of those areas. When we get into legibility, start to think about what it is that we are working with. What do we want to have happen with this? So we start looking at readability. Can we read it? And legibility, can we actually understand then each individual spot that's there? So we want to start looking for, what do we want to do? Well, we want to make sure that we have an ample X height. We're going to talk about our characters. What is that X height? If you look a little bit even at X height based upon point size, so we're going to play into how tall are those ascenders. If we have a high X height, then what's going to happen is the ascenders are going to be much shorter. So the difference between that vertical stem of our N versus our H, that vertical stroke, what's the difference between that? From a legibility standpoint, if we start to make that smaller, all of a sudden, when we're based on a percentage, we may find that it may be difficult to read. Do we have open counters? Look at the stroke contrast. we have sufficient stroke width? Because as we go through and we start to break these down, we're dealing with pixels. And what's going to end up happening with it is that if we go through and we draw a grid, we have to fit our characters inside of a grid. There's no longer the set that we have when we start thinking about it from the standpoint of a vector graphic that has these nice curves to them. We now have blocks. So the easiest thing to go back to is start to think about, what's it going to look like if I build this out of Lego blocks? How do I get that curve to happen? With all just simply square pieces. Simple shapes are going to be much easier for us to read when we go through and we start dealing with our web type. So as we go through to select it, we look at the contrast between our colors. What do we have inside of here? What colors are we using? What's the background color? If we go through and we have the greatest amount of contrast between those, it's going to be easier to read. What happens when they're close to one another? It's hard to read, but what also happens?
It's all smushed together.
Yeah, it can be smushed together. I think your eyes are going to feel. If I go ahead and hand you a 20-page paper, I want you to read this. This is yellow copy on a white page. You going to want to read it? No. You're going to have a headache. By the time you're done, your head is going to be just hurting. Because what's going to happen is going to be so much strain on your eyes to go through and actually read that, because there's just not enough contrast there. So with that, we go through and start to look at it. Understand what's happening with it. Also know that these bright colors also are going to detract from readability. If for some reason you want to go through and use some sort of bright colors, I would recommend that you use the bright color as a background, and you still use something that's got a high contrast then for your actual foreground characters. You're also probably going to find as you go through and you start to work on web or put anything on a screen that you need to use text that's a little bit larger than what you would use in any other print stuff. The other thing we want to start to work with is we want to then reduce the length of our type for our columns inside here. So we start looking at keeping the line lengths a bit shorter. As we go through and start to use it, they talk 12 words. When you go through and type it out, that would be where they want to keep it, that or smaller as you go through and work with it. Also start to think about how can you chunk your type. Breaking these things up so we don't have to read really big, long areas of type. And then since we talk about the space and we have to deal with pixels, condensed type, you probably want to stay away from condensed type when we get into anything web, anything screen-based. Now, what do you think one of our biggest challenges right now as a designer when we start talking about things that we need to do for web versus things that we need to do for print?
Sorry, could you say that again?
No,
Sorry.
no, Siri, I can't. Or maybe that was somebody else sending a question in. So, what's the biggest problem that we have right now? When we design something that traditionally would go to print, where are we finding that now? On the web. Right, so what our challenge now as designers comes into is that anything that we design, most likely, I probably would put it, and this is just something else around, I bet you it's over 90% of everything that gets designed, that same key element has a digital life. So you go through and you design a PDF poster for a concert. That same poster, that PDF, somebody uploads to the web and uses it for some sort of marketing on there, or they send it out in an email. So the challenge that we have as designers as we start to work with stuff is that back when we used to design, it was you were designing either something for web or you're designing something to print. Now, I mean, even when I was doing stuff for the Chamber of Commerce, I designed the stuff for print, but it would have a print version, it would always have a web version too, but they were the same document. So you just had to be aware as you chose typefaces that you knew this was going to hit digital as well. So in a lot of ways, if you know what's going on both, you tend to have to design for that digital side more so than the print side. The print side will handle so much more stuff than digital will. Are those areas coming together to where they're getting a lot closer? Yes, as I mentioned, screen-wise. What you have for pixels on these displays inside of here, there's just so much more content that's actually able to go onto those. So some of this stuff is kind of starting to move itself away. Questions on that? Yes.
Are you going to be mobile first design? Just like design towards the screen?
So there, from a design standpoint, there's a lot of stuff, yes, that is going towards, there's a lot of mobile pieces to it. Anything that I design, if somebody talks to me about designing something on a freelance basis, I always think, is this going to go digital as well? You even ask that question, is this going to be have a digital life as well? Yes, it's going to. We're going to use it on this and this. That's going to go on Twitter, it's going to go on Facebook, all these places. We're probably going to use it as a splash screen at the start of videos on YouTube. At that point, being aware of that will play in a little bit with start thinking about how large it's going to be. But as a designer, can you get away with stuff? You can get away with a lot more stuff now than you could 15 years ago when we're talking about screen versus print.
I was just curious, like, I code and I develop already, and I was just curious to see a lot, I work with other people who design it, and they do a lot of mobile first phone design, but we're making their website.
Right, and so with that, when you start getting to it, when you design for the smallest device, so if you think about designing for a smartphone, that smartphone is going to translate into a desktop version fairly well.
As a developer, I tend to go small workspace.
Yes.
Scale.
Yes, and that's what you want to do. The other thing that'll happen is sometimes you'll have something, and that's part of the reason why when you start seeing icons on smartphones, people are like, well, why don't I can see what it is, but why isn't there any text on it? Because you're not going to be able to read it. By the time it gets down to that little tiny icon, you're not going to be able to read anything on it. That's why most of what you see on icons, the text gets pulled. Yes, as they continue to expand what resolution we can see on a display, you're now starting to see more of the icons now coming in and having text built into them because you're able to read it. In the past, those would have been just giant blocks. Anything else? All right, let me jump over here.
Typography. It's everywhere we look. In the books we read, on the websites we visit, even in everyday life, on street signs, bumper stickers, and product packaging. Simply put, typography is the style or appearance of text. It can also refer to the art of working with text, something.
What's that?
Can you please turn down the volume?
Turn it down a little bit? Okay. You're probably sitting right underneath the speaker. Oh, no, you're not.
Probably do all the time if you create documents or other projects for work, school, or yourself. Typography can be an intimidating subject, but it doesn't have to be. You only need to know a little to make a big difference in the stuff you do every day. So let's get started. First, some common types of fonts and what you need to know about them. Serif fonts have little strokes called serifs attached to the main part of the letter. Because of their classic look, they're a good choice for more traditional projects. They're also common in print publications, like magazines and newspapers. Sans serif fonts don't have that extra stroke, hence the name, which is French for without serif. This style is considered more clean and modern than serif fonts. Also, it tends to be easier to read on computer screens, including smartphones and tablets. Display fonts come in many different styles, like script, black letter, all caps, and just plain fancy. Because of their decorative nature, display fonts are best for small amounts of text. For example, titles and headers, and more graphic-heavy designs. In a way, fonts have their own language. They all have something to say beyond the words on the page. They can come across as casual or neutral, exotic or graphic. That's why it's important to think about your message and pick a font that fits. Some fonts come with extra baggage, like Comic Sans, curls, papyrus, and many more. There's nothing particularly wrong with these fonts. They just have a certain reputation for being outdated and overused. If you find yourself tempted by them, think twice and consider using something else. There are many fonts with a similar look and feel that are less likely to detract from your message. When deciding which fonts to use, less is more. It's best to limit yourself to 1 or 2 per project. If you need more contrast, try repeating one of your fonts in a different size, weight, or style. This trick is practically foolproof for creating interesting combinations that work. You've probably heard the saying, opposites attract. Well, the same is true for fonts. Don't be afraid to combine font styles that are different but complementary, like sans serif with serif, short with tall, or decorative with simple. This can be challenging at first, but don't despair. Look to other designs for inspiration, and soon you'll get the hang of it. Maybe you've heard terms like kerning, leading, tracking, and hierarchy. For those with more experience, these concepts are essential for creating professional-looking designs. As a beginner, you don't need to know everything about these terms, just enough to inform your work and help you talk about design with more confidence. Hierarchy is used to guide the reader's eye to whatever is most important. In other words, it shows them where to begin and where to go next, using different levels of emphasis. Establishing hierarchy is simple. Just decide which elements you want the reader to notice first, then make them stand out. High-level items are usually larger, bolder, or different in some way. Remember to keep it simple and stick to just a few complementary styles. Leading is the space between lines of text, also known as line spacing. If you're not sure how much line spacing to use, don't fret. The default is usually fine. The goal is to make your text as comfortable to read as possible. Too much or too little spacing can make things unpleasant for the reader. Tracking is the overall space between characters, sometimes called character spacing. Most programs let you condense or expand this depending on your needs. In some designs, you might adjust your tracking to create a certain artistic effect. It can also help you fix fonts that are poorly spaced to begin with. Kerning is the space between specific characters. Unlike tracking, it varies over the course of the word because each letter fits together differently. Some fonts have what we call bad kerning, making certain letters look improperly spaced. If a font you're using has bad kerning, it's best to cut your losses and choose something else. Well-crafted text can mean the difference between an ordinary project and an extraordinary project, even if you're just getting started with design. All it takes is an interest in typography, and you'll start to notice more, see more, and be able to do more in your own work. We hope you enjoyed learning the basics of typography. Check out the rest of our design topics, including color, images, and composition.
So that gives you a good example of what can happen with type as you start to work with type, getting used to type, playing with them. Think about that last one on the getting notice. What the big difference between the first one, just plain type on there versus going in there and actually designing with the type. So as you start working with typography, I always say to go into the different classifications and choose one that you like. Start to really learn from that, start to use that one, push that. Because what's going to happen is you're going to find that there's a certain typeface that you go to. This is my sans serif typeface, this is my serif typeface, this is my display type. And you'll use those over and over again because you're going to start to understand how all of the items work with each other. So don't be afraid to go in there and choose something, look at stuff, and have one that you really like.